The wild card round featured 4 games that weren't so close and one that was really nice and close. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about 2 coaching changes and start to preview the divisional round matchups that we already know about. All coming up next on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen, as we are every Monday. And we're going to continue this throughout the playoffs because we like doing this. So, Nick, how did you enjoy your wild card weekend?
I thought it was enjoyable overall. I mean, really just a great 5-day span of football if we're including the college football games as well, which, you know, Notre Dame and Penn State was fantastic on Thursday. Ohio State, Texas, wouldn't say it was fantastic, but a good game nonetheless. And then, of course, that led us into what was overall a solid wild card weekend. And, you know, certainly the best game of the weekend had to be last night. Commanders, Buccaneers, Washington winning that one in walk-off fashion. The divisional doink, I guess, is what we're calling it. You know, it sent them to the divisional round as opposed to happening in the divisional, but we will live with that. But I guess we can start with that game because I think that's the most fun to break down. You know, I was on with our guy Joe Serralo on VSiN last night, kind of talking through, you know, what led to this win for Washington. The number one thing that stuck out to me, Jeff, was the ball control by the Commanders. Right? I mean, Baker Mayfield was really efficient. He was pretty good last night. He was 15 of 18 passing. He only threw the ball 18 times. You know, Washington ripped off 5 drives that went for double-digit plays. I mean, they owned time of possession, 35 minutes to about 24 for the Buccaneers. They ran 25 more plays. You know, this is a team that's been really good at kind of controlling clock and picking up third downs really the entire season. But 8 of 15 on third down, 3 of 5 on fourth down. You know, had a couple stall outs where they didn't get any points and still were able to get enough defensively to end up winning this game. Went well under the 50.5 total. So really, really impressive game from Washington. And yet another, you know, come from behind last second, or I should say final quarter drive by Jaden Daniels to put this team in the position that it needed to be. A couple of huge mistakes, of course, by Tampa Bay. You know, you have a 3rd and 1 that you can't convert. You had the fumble deep in your own territory. So I think Tampa Bay is certainly looking at this as a game that it should have won. But these are the games that Washington and Jaden Daniels specifically have continued to come through in throughout this season.
Yeah, and, you know, there's a contrast. Washington went for it on 4th down 4 times. The Bucs did not go for it on 4th down on that key sequence there at the end. After the 3rd down flail, which happened in part because they got the snap count wrong. On the 2nd down play, Bucky Irving also looked like he could have had a 1st down and didn't. You know, hard to criticize Bucky Irving too much because he was awesome and it's just one play. But it was kind of, you know, Dan Quinn got some of the little things right and Todd Bowles didn't. You know, the time management in the end of the first half was really awful by Bowles, and it wasn't much better, I thought, in the second half. And that ending sequence there. They didn't call timeout after the 1st down run, which was netted like the Washington 7 yards.
Yep.
Why? You know, I don't get that at all. I don't think he got a whole lot right as far as that goes. It wasn't as egregious as Raheem Morris in the Sunday night game against the Commanders, but the Commanders seem to keep getting these breaks.
It's hard to say. Is it a break or are they manufacturing this themselves? You know, I think in part it was taking advantage of the Todd Bowles decision making, which has been there all season. This is not unique for Todd Bowles. It feels like every week, you know, we're talking about one of these situations with time management and timeout usage. So I think if you're Washington, you kind of go into this game knowing that, all right, if it's going to be close, maybe we have an advantage in that area. But it's, again, a disappointing way for this Buccaneers season to end. I did think they were, you know, the rightful team to come out of the NFC South. You know, for a while, it felt like it was the Falcons division to lose and the Saints were maybe in the mix. And, you know, I still think Tampa Bay, you know, putting together a 10-win season with the injuries that they had, it's impressive. But yeah, for it to come down to, you know, the 2 key mistakes, right? I think you can get on Todd Bowles for the clock management. Ultimately, if he plays that differently, you know, we're still looking at a desperation situation for Tampa Bay with only a handful of seconds on the clock at the end. So I don't know if that's really what did it in, but the fumble, man, you know, the kind of miscommunication on that play was supposed to be a jet sweep. You know, the receiver almost kind of knocked it out of Baker Mayfield's hands. I mean, that's really what changed things because, you know, at that point, you know, Tampa Bay, there was still enough time on the clock. It was still early 4th quarter. And Tampa Bay was deep in their own territory. So it's not like that you can just assume that they were going to put a touchdown on the board and make this a 2-score game. But
right,
at the very least, you're going to take time off the clock and you're going to make this a little bit more difficult for Washington. But again, I want to focus on the Commander side. I mean, I think they earned this win going on the road. Jaden Daniels making his first career playoff start in a relatively difficult environment. I think this sets up a really interesting matchup now against Detroit in this banged up defense. Obviously, the Lions are big favorites. 8.5 is the number right now across the board. I'm really interested to see, what Washington can draw up to try to take advantage of some of those injuries. I mean, I think the mobility of Jaden Daniels, his continued ability to find these guys, it's always over the middle of the field. It feels like it's like 3rd and 8, and there's Zach Ertz wide open for 15 yards.
Right.
They're going to be able to put some pressure on this Lions defense, maybe in a way that a team like Tampa wouldn't. And, of course, if you're the Lions, is this a matchup that you want, as opposed to facing the winner of Minnesota and the Rams? Like, I think you want Washington, right? It's still a rookie quarterback now making his second postseason start, but the Commanders present some matchup issues, I think, that neither of those other teams do with the mobility of Daniels.
Yeah. On the flip side, Washington hasn't seen Detroit. Detroit hasn't seen Washington this year, whereas either the Rams or the Vikings would have been a rematch. Rams week 1 of the season, Vikings obviously just a week ago. So I think from a familiarity standpoint or lack thereof, it might, I think the Lions are probably would prefer that also. The thing that disturbs me about the Commanders is they're not running the ball very well at all. Brian Robinson is a shell of his pre-injury self. And I think they need to really make a hard determination whether he is their best running back right now. It may not all be on him, but he was 10 for 16 yesterday, last night. And, this isn't a new thing. He's struggled ever since coming back from that injury. Remember, he played when we all thought he was going to definitely be out. That Cowboys game, he got hurt twice. Comes back and plays that, I think he got hurt the week before that, if I recall correctly. He wasn't even supposed to be playing in that game. I just think he's a warrior and he's playing through this and all that, and he thinks he's helping the team, but I think they need to decide. And they didn't have Eckler back then. Eckler was concussed. He was on the IR, so they didn't have that as a pivot. But they have Chris Rodriguez, they have Jeremy McNichols, and they have Eckler. They have options. I don't think Robinson's getting it done right now, and I think they're going to need to run the ball better against Detroit, and I think you can against Detroit given all their injuries in their front seven.
Yeah, I think all good points by you all around. I mean, Brian Robinson was 10 of 16 or 10 for 16, I should say, last night. And I think it's a good Buccaneers run defense, right? So I think, Washington ideally.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think ideally, Washington wants to control this game on the ground, and really they had no success doing that. I mean, even Daniels carried 13 times for just 36 yards. Eckler had like one big run. That was about it. 8 for 27. I think in theory you should be able to run on Detroit, but this defense has held up pretty well against the run, even since these injuries set in. I mean, only 2 teams have topped 100 yards against the Lions defense since week 9. And those were, Minnesota in week 18 and then Buffalo in that crazy game in week 15. So it's certainly not a great run defense by any means. I think there are some matchups that Washington should be able to exploit because it does feel like this Commanders passing game, as consistently as they're able to find guys, when they absolutely need it, like you don't necessarily want to live that way, right? You don't want to just kind of have to rely on converting third downs at like a 65% rate on the road at Detroit. But, I think they were able to take advantage of some of the injuries in the Bucs secondary. That was something we talked a lot about this past week. And I mean, Terry McLaurin had his usual, crazy catch down the sideline, a couple other big plays. De'Ami Brown had himself a night. Zacchaeus had a couple big plays. So that's kind of been the formula for Washington is, run the ball effectively and then mix in these big plays. But they were still able to hit those big plays despite not having any running game last night. Yeah.
The catch by McLaurin along the sideline. Oh, pump that into my veins. I mean, I love seeing players ball out in the playoffs like that. And this was the De'Ami Brown game. It was fun to see that too. He is now their number 2 receiver that they've been looking for all season long. Can he stay on the field is a question, but for now, he is that guy. There are 3 other Browns drafted in the RotoWire Sirius XM show playoff draft, and none of them were De'Ami. I think he's been the best Brown so far. A couple of them didn't have, Hollywood Brown didn't have a chance to play this weekend, but we do regret not drafting him. Quentin Johnston's sitting there with that big bagel on my roster right now, and I could really have used that right now. But anyways, it seems like that number is too big. You said 8.5. It was
8.5.
Yeah, I guessed like 5.5. So
Well,
I'm way off.
I think it's about right. I think the expectation is that Detroit could have David Montgomery back this week. I think that's huge. We'll see if they get any pieces back defensively.
Yeah.
This will be the biggest line that the Commanders have faced this year. They were 7.5-point dogs against your Bengals early in the season. They were 7.5-point dogs against Baltimore. Covered both of those games. Kept both of those within a touchdown. We'll see if we get any movement here. I don't think it moves significantly. Total's up at 55.5, by the way. So I think the expectation, at least, is that we'll get some points here. I still think Detroit wins relatively comfortably. I think getting the bye was so important for the Lions, maybe more so than any team in recent history. I think everybody wants the bye, but not everybody is as banged up as Detroit was. So I think they'll be ready for this at home. It's hard for me to picture Jaden Daniels, having some sort of blow up performance. Like, I still think he'll be good, but you're looking at a Detroit team that most likely will be able to, if Montgomery is back, I think look a lot more like the team that we saw for most of the regular season. So this will be a spot that I think it ultimately comes down to how many points can the Commanders put up, because I think you have to pencil in Detroit for 30 plus, and you're probably asking the Commanders to score at least 24 to 27 if you're asking them to cover.
Yeah, and so the thing is, I even with or without Montgomery, I have no fear about Detroit putting up a number. It's just a question: can the Commanders keep up? I think they're live, but keep in mind, no Carlton Davis, no like Aleem McNeil. I think that's a big one. I don't think Hutchinson's going to be back anytime. I think they were saying hopefully the NFC Championship game, maybe the Super Bowl. Zadarius Smith was a perfect targeted ad for this team. He has been very good as of late. I like him. Terrion Arnold, you got to remember, he's questionable coming in. He got hurt again in that Vikings game. So that's another one there. There's still some big names that are going to be missing defensively for Detroit. And that's my hesitation on such a big line for 8.5 there. That's why I think I had a lower number.
Yeah, to put a bow on this, I mean, again, I think the key for Washington is to kind of do what you did against Tampa Bay and limit possessions for your opponent. Yeah. And I think that's a lot easier to do against the Buccaneers than it is against this Lions team with the way that they're rolling offensively. So I don't know how effective that will be, but I think that is the goal here. Is you want this kind of time of possession discrepancy. Even if you're settling for field goals, you're okay with like a 7-minute field goal drive where you run 14 plays, because that just means Detroit's offense isn't out there.
Yeah. Let's move on to the other NFC game yesterday, Eagles and Packers. This kind of went, at least on the Packers offensive side of things, the way we expected. I don't know about the Eagles offense. I think the Eagles offense was very disappointing. We'll get to that here, but the Jordan Love has been disappointing for a while. We knew this. Josh Jacobs is great, but he can only do so much. And then you add on Jaden Reed got hurt in this game. They had a bunch of injuries that got piled on late. Even Jacobs was banged up at the end. But the real takeaway here is Jordan Love was not the same quarterback that we saw in the playoffs last year and what we expected going into this year. He threw a couple of hospital balls up there that were kind of really pretty awful. And yes, the receivers could do better in some instances. But the fact of the matter is this is not the same passing offense as we had hoped it would be.
No. And, I think in a lot of ways, this was kind of the result that I was bracing for. It was maybe a little bit uglier even than we expected. I was on Philly 4.5. I was on the under, but I didn't think Philly played all that well offensively, right? I mean, this was like
no, they didn't.
plus B- game for the Eagles. And it is worth noting that Saquon Barkley could have ripped off like a 60-yard touchdown at the end and instead decided to slide down. So that certainly would have made the offensive numbers look a little bit better. But there was a period where, Green Bay, obviously they go down 10-0. You fumble the opening kickoff, which, my goodness, man. I mean, for a team that's 32nd at PFF in special teams grade this season, for that to happen to begin this game, you and I talked a lot last week about what is the key for Green Bay, not necessarily to win, but to cover, to keep this game close. You can't play from behind. And we knew they'd get the ball first. They always get the ball first. And what do? They immediately give it up. Now, I thought Jacobs recovered that fumble, or not Jacobs, Nixon, recovered that fumble, whatever. Either way, that's not how it was called. First player to lose an opening kickoff in a playoff game since 2002, by the way. Like how rare that occasion is. So obviously you just hand Philly a touchdown right away. You're down 10-0 a couple drives later. But the Green Bay defense, I thought, buckled down and played about as well as you could expect in this game. And at one point, they forced the Eagles into 4 straight punts, 3 and outs in that span. And the Packers, went out on or missed a field goal, and then had 2 interceptions in that span. So there was a time, even after this disastrous start to the game, even after nothing's working for Green Bay, the defense kept them in it, gave them opportunities to claw back, and the offense just could get nothing going. Nothing going. I mean, outside of the one, Jacobs long run that set up the short touchdown, that was it. And it certainly wasn't a good game for Jordan Love. The interception to Zach Bond was brutal. The other two, I didn't necessarily mind because I thought Green Bay would have to take some of these shots. One of them was just kind of a slightly underthrown deep ball, nice play by Darius Slay. The other one was late in the game, kind of a desperation shot into triple coverage. Like, you have to take those chances if you're Green Bay and you're down your top 3 receivers by the end of the game. So the interceptions, I don't think necessarily were the issue, but I thought Love it was an extension of the final 2 games of the regular season. Just hesitancy, not looking confident. I don't know if you remember, Jeff, there was one play where, Love looked like he was about to scramble. And then you see on the replay that he had like 10 yards if he wanted it. And at the last second, he like throws a swing pass to a running back who was covered and immediately lit up. And it's like, what are you doing, man? You got at least 8 free yards if you just take this. And it speaks to, I think, this version of Love that we've seen over the last month, where occasionally you see the flash plays, but there's been a lot more hesitancy and kind of questioning himself as opposed to some of the wild plays that we were seeing toward the end of last season and earlier this season. So the final result, I think, again, is what most Packers fans expected. I was watching with a bunch of Packers fans yesterday, and everybody basically agreed, like, yeah, of all the playoff losses of the last 10 or 15 years, this is the one that stings the least because it didn't come in crushing fashion. And I think expectations were significantly lowered for this team just in the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think the fact that they were lowered is frustrating because this is a good team. I think this is a really good defense. I think I think they're better than the Chargers. They're better than the Texans. They're better than the Broncos. There's matchups out there that, I think week 18 actually mattered. Packers, Packers, it wouldn't have mattered for the Packers to win, but the fact that the Commanders won, got to play the Bucs instead of the Eagles, I think that's a big deal. It ended up being a big deal because just from running into that defense versus running into the Bucs defense, I mean, I think that alone is worth a lot. And once with the pairings were, it was the perfectly bad matchup for the Packers.
For this version of the Packers, yes. For sure. Yeah. For the early season version of the Packers, I think it was actually a fun matchup. What we saw in week 1, but they're not the same team. And, I think we could talk about how the matchups ended up shaking down after week 18. But I think just from a confidence standpoint, too, it's like, I think you could play the card of, well, Jordan Love got banged up. We pulled a lot of starters in the second half. We didn't really care if we lost. I think they kind of cared. I think it was a little bit alarming that they essentially played at least a full half of football against Chicago and looked terrible doing it. I think that was kind of we want to build some confidence type of game, much like what we saw from Houston. We only saw one drive out of the Houston starters in week 18, but CJ Stroud went 6 of 6, led a touchdown drive. And they said, all right, that's enough. We just wanted to get a little bit of confidence back. Did that carry over to Saturday? Is that the reason they blew out the Chargers? I don't know, but you at least had some positive vibe going into that game. And it was just all negative for Green Bay. Like you never really felt like there was a path to them winning this game. And again, to go back to Love, he wasn't good, but I've gone back and watched a lot of the dropbacks, a lot of the throws. There was not a whole lot open. It's not like he was missing open guys. And I think that speaks to, like you said, this just being, it's not a good matchup for Green Bay, especially without Christian Watson, without having that field spacer. I mean, I think the Eagles' ability to control the line of scrimmage, the Eagles have advantages at linebacker. They have one of the best secondaries in terms of talent in the NFL. Like, it was just, it would have taken, I think, some errors on the Eagles side. You probably needed 1 or 2 turnovers for Philly, which of course didn't happen. I mean, if you lose the turnover battle 4-0, you're not winning this game on the road.
Yeah, agreed. Eagles, they needed every single one of those turnovers though. Offensively, they were terrible. Jonathan Banks says, they were terrible.
Yeah, they were bad.
It's true. It's true. They were terrible. Deep into the third quarter, Hurts had 39 passing yards. You're starting to see some frustration again in the sidelines from that we saw earlier in the year. Hurts was pretty bad. There's not a whole lot getting around that. He ended up for 131 and 2 touchdowns, no turnovers. But I mean, they weren't moving the ball very well at all. Barkley got his, but as you alluded to, he had that 17-yarder at the end of the game where he slid at the end. They had the kickoff turnover. They were gifted, the field position, which they turned into a touchdown. But man, I wanted more. I really wanted more. They did the fake tush push. That play would have worked with a better throw. Brown was open. It was a smart play. And I credit to them for trying that, putting that on tape. I think they need to do that more often. because that play is going to be there a lot. I even like they kind of did a fake fumble on that too when he went back on that. That was fun. It didn't click, but man, it's frustrating. Of course, I have the Eagles stack in our playoff league, and except for minus Barkley, of course, minus Goddard. So like, of course, no one had Jahan Dotson. Yeah, Jahan Dotson, one catch. But hey, there's that 3rd round draft pick. It's a touchdown. So there you go, son. That's why we did this.
He's addicted to scoring touchdowns. You know, when you think Jahan Dotson, you just synonymous with finding himself in the end zone. I mean, Jalen Hurts went almost 2 full quarters without a completion at one point, which is kind of crazy. And again, that was in the midst of the Eagles, kind of going somewhere between 3 and 5 and out on a bunch of drives in a row. And even their scoring drives in the second half, they had the touchdown drive that was finished off on the Dallas Goedert like triple stiff arm play on Carrington Valentine. That was set up by a personal foul by Green Bay, and they had one on the field goal drive following that as well. So, I don't love necessarily. I didn't think either of those were overly egregious. I think sometimes you see those let go, but getting that call in Philly, like it's probably going to go against you. When you're shoving Saquon Barkley to the ground after a play when he's out of bounds, like what are you doing? You're just handing him a free 15 yards. So again, the Eagles, I wonder. Did they almost go conservative knowing that this defense could win them the game? You'd like to think that if you could play better offense, you just would. But I thought that, Philly played it pretty conservatively, especially in that first half, after putting that first touchdown up. It's not like they were dropping Jalen Hurts back every time and he just wasn't making throws. Like, it was just kind of run for a 2-yard gain, maybe an incomplete pass. And then, all right, we're punting again. Just a weird game for Philly. Certainly not one that inspires a ton of confidence. And we talked about Detroit, maybe depending on how you look at the matchup, lucking out and facing the Commanders. If you're the Eagles now, I mean, you're getting Minnesota or the Rams coming to you the next weekend. So I don't know if this is, you're not thrilled probably with how this turned out. If you're Philly, you're happy to get a win, certainly, but doesn't necessarily feel like this was a momentum building victory for the Eagles.
I agree. And, I think sometimes we get lost in the moment, the recency of it there, and like, I can't see them going on after this. Well, the last time the Eagles won the Super Bowl, they were terrible in the game that they beat Atlanta. I don't know if you remember that game. That was the Julio Jones not on the field on a critical 3rd and goal play. Like, what are we even doing here? Sort of thing. Atlanta kind of gifted that to them. I think I think that might have even been underdogs. Cause remember, this is where they lost Carson Wentz going into the playoffs. Foles is at quarterback. Minnesota has the miracle win over the Saints, the Diggs play. They go in, I think they were even favored in that game, and Philly just put the hammer to them. And I'm sorry, Peter Shanky, for bringing up this memory here, but Philly hammered them in that game when, there weren't too many positive vibes on Philly going into that game. And then, of course, they won the wild shootout against the Pats in the Super Bowl that year, too.
Vikings were 3-point road favorites in that game, and the Eagles won 38-7 after winning 15-10 against Atlanta in the wild card. So if I'm an Eagles fan, I'm not panicking. It's the playoffs. Survive in advance. You got through. Your defense dominated. Exactly. You're going to be favored again, whether it's Minnesota or the Rams. And I think you also got to keep in mind, Jalen Hurts basically hadn't played in 3 weeks. So if you want to chalk it up to some rust, maybe that's it.
Yeah. Fair enough. They still got the cover regardless, despite how they look there.
Never doubt.
Exactly. We're going to hit up the AFC, but first, we're going to share a quick note from our friends over at DraftKings Pick 6.
We're proud to be brought to you by DraftKings Pick 6. So many NFL offerings each week over at Pick 6. Been enjoying playing on the Pick 6 platform each and every week of the NFL season. Think a certain quarterback will throw for more than 300 yards. How about your favorite receiver scoring a touchdown? Check out Pick 6, the newest way to play fantasy football and win cash right now with DraftKings. Here's how it works. Just pick 2 to 6 players of the same sport and choose if they'll have more or less of a given stat. Yards, catches, touchdowns, etc. Lock in those picks and compete against opponents for a shot at huge cash prizes. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use our code ROTOPICK. That's ROTOPICK. Again, ROTOPICK, ROTOPICK. If you're a new Pick 6 customer, play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits guaranteed. Just use that code, ROTOPICK. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-788-997777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick Six not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos.
The Buffalo Bills held on, pulled away in the second half against the Denver Broncos to win 31-7. But this game should have been tied at halftime. The Broncos missed a field goal right before the half. So did the Packers. Actually missed a field goal. McManus finally missed. Forgot to add that into the pile of mistakes there. But that I really do think that missed field goal played a big difference in that game. It should have been 10-10 at the half.
Yep.
Instead, they go in with the lead. Buffalo gets the stop right away. Instead of like at risk of even being behind later in this game, they're ahead, and then they pulled away and just they get some things to go right. That crazy fourth down play to Ty Johnson, that kind of after that, it was just kind of everything spiraled out of control. But you know what? Denver was game for defensively for a while. Offensively, they had that great first drive, and they did really nothing else after that.
First of all, I agree with you on the field goal. I think you look at the final score, 31-7, and it's easy to say that wouldn't have mattered. But from a momentum standpoint, I think it absolutely mattered. I think Denver going in, they got the ball at their own 8-yard line with like a minute 50 on the clock to drive all the way down, get yourself into field goal range. A couple really nice throws from Bo Nix on that drive, including a big one to Cortland Sutton that set up a makeable field goal. Not a gimme, a 50-yarder. Right. But if you make that, I think you're galvanized a bit, at least going into the second half. But Denver, just whatever magic they had in that first half, you hit the big one to Troy Franklin to go up 7-0. A lot of that evaporated in the second half, and this was yet another game similar to what we talked about in Washington, Tampa Bay, where Buffalo dominated time of possession, dominated plays run, 30 more plays, over 41 minutes of possession in this game, 471 to 224 in terms of total yardage. Like all those would be top 5 in the NFL this season, if we're including the regular season, in terms of how lopsided this game really was. So the interesting thing is, despite all that, Buffalo really didn't pull away. Like they didn't make this a 2-score game until late in the third quarter. And like you said, that came on a pretty wild play, 4th and 1, where I don't know why that's your play call in that situation. You think you're just looking to pick up the first down as opposed to taking a crazy shot to the end zone where your third running back is making a diving catch. And that was a hell of a play by Ty Johnson, but kind of emblematic of the way that this Bills season has gone, where it feels like those are always the plays that the Bills convert, and like every other team, that's like a 5%er. And it was a great play. He got his hand under it. Everything was legit. And that kind of felt like the real backbreaker for Denver. I think if they had been able to get a hold there, it still would have been 13-7. You still got time in the third quarter. You could kind of rally yourself, but that was such a backbreaking play. All of a sudden it's 21-7. They get the 2-point conversion, and the Bills were kind of off and running. But I do think the final score here is a little misleading. Again, it was really lopsided. Buffalo dominated this game, but again, it really wasn't until the final 17 minutes of game time that this turned into a comfortable win. Agreed.
And on that Ty Johnson play, I think Romo and Nance got it right. I think that Allen wanted to run, and Denver knew that he wanted to run. So, but they had that stopped. So they had the shadow on him. They had someone stalking him, making sure that he wasn't able to run on that, which meant that you had Johnson in single coverage, and you have 10 seconds. Somebody's going to get open. And somebody did, which is interesting. This whole game was interesting. I don't think I heard Patrick Surtain's name called once, which, you would think you would hear it a little bit often. Yeah. He ended up making 5 tackles. So obviously he was there a few times, but they clearly were avoiding going after him at all. It wasn't like, and that's the beauty of the Bills is they don't have that number one alpha receiver. He can go to anybody, and he did go to anybody. Yeah. He went to Samuel on the one touchdown. Shakir got did a lot of bubble screens and things like that with Shakir. He had a couple good punt returns too. Shakir's a fun player. I love him.
He's so good.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And yet you look at the overall stats, over 200 rushing yards, over 200 passing yards. They got all the yardage. Just didn't even feel they dominated, and it didn't feel like they dominated, like you said.
I think that's what good teams do. This game felt closer than it was, and Denver had their chances, but I was surprised when I dug in on the stats after the game to see that it was that much of a disparity. But Denver did almost nothing offensively in the second half. They had one long drive that ended up stalling out in the red zone. Other than that, they were struggling to even gain positive yardage on their other drives. I mean, they had like 50 yards of offense in the second half. So that was a big contributing factor. But I think you bring up a good point on Surtain, right? I think he's the favorite to win Defensive Player of the Year. He's probably going to win it. He's had an incredible season. He's also made his bones, kind of shadowing these wide receiver ones, holding them, under their usual output. The Bills don't have a wide receiver one. I think it's hard to try to assign Patrick Surtain to somebody. It's like, who do you take away, right? I mean, Khalil Shakir is not really the type of player that he typically goes up against. You got so many options in this Bills offense. Like you said, Curtis Samuel comes out of nowhere with his biggest game of the year. It was yet another explosive performance from Amari Cooper, who caught 2 of 3 targets for 8 yards. I still have a feeling that at some point, Amari Cooper is going to make a huge play. Maybe it's this coming weekend against Baltimore, but his usage just continues to kind of be bizarre ever since that trade. Like, it felt like such a good fit, and it's like, all right, we're just going to make you our wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, and we'll see how it works out.
We're going to put you in the decoy slot is what we're going to put you
more
in
or less.
Yeah. It seems like it's happened. I think you mentioned it, but it bears repeating. The time of possession, 41-43 to 18-17.
Yep.
This is astounding. You were going to talk about the Bucks not getting enough plays. I mean, the Broncos said, okay, well, this is even worse. 42-72 in total plays, 26-13 in total first downs. I mean, every way you look at it. Bo Nix wasn't awful. There's a couple of throws that, he could have been better on third down. He made it on that first drive. He threw a couple of dimes. And I'm like, it's 7-0 Denver. They hold Buffalo to a field goal on the first drive. You're like, okay, I'm a little nervous now if I'm a Buffalo backer here. And just, they didn't really do much threatening other than the 2-minute drill at the end of the half there. But still, that was a massive play. Doinks off the upright there. And, the second half was just all hopeless. It was so bad in the second half.
Yeah, it was. I mean, what's interesting is, talking about the time of possession discrepancy, this would, including the regular season, it was the 4th most possession any team has had in a game. Number 1, Minnesota against Jacksonville in that bizarre 12-7 win when Minnesota went 0-5 in the red zone. Number 2 was Cincinnati against Denver just a few weeks ago. Number 3 was Denver against Kansas City in week 18. Which was, to me, the most lopsided game of the entire year because Kansas City didn't play anybody. So to kind of look at it through that lens of like, you think of like the degree to which Denver dominated KC in week 18, and the script was completely flipped here, and Denver was on the other side of that possession wise.
That was the second shutout of the year, right? We got a second shutout, right?
Yes, that one, and then Green Bay over New Orleans
on the Monday night game. Yeah. Just interesting disparities there. But okay. That leads us to Baltimore, Pittsburgh. Before we preview Buffalo, Baltimore, we got to give Baltimore and Pittsburgh their due for that game. So Baltimore, I mean, they jumped Pittsburgh early. This was 21-0 at halftime. It was really over at that point in time. Pittsburgh kind of sort of made it interesting. Like they get it to 21-7, like, oh, okay, it's 28-14. Okay, got the, and then immediately every time it's like Henry at the long run to make it 28-7 again. You're like, oh, okay, this is over.
Yeah. This one, I think another game that, much like Green Bay Philly, to me went about as expected. I was on Baltimore. I was on the under as well, so we kind of threaded that needle. I was, obviously you're worried about Baltimore putting up 34, 37 and kind of ruining the under by themselves. But, I thought the Ravens, did a pretty good job after building that 21-0 lead of really just sitting on it for most of the second half. And, of course, in typical Pittsburgh fashion, their only 2 scores came on, deep balls, one to Van Jefferson, one to George Pickens, where 2 defenders converge and somehow both miss the ball.
Right.
So that's kind of emblematic of how the Steelers passing game has gone. Like that's really all that works for them is, throw it up to George Pickens and hopefully it works. So they hit 2 of those. It wasn't nearly enough. I mean, there was zero running game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And of course, part of that is game script when you're down multiple scores in the first half, but Najee Harris, 6 for 17, Jaylen Warren, 2 for 6. I mean, that was it. They had under 30 rushing yards as a team. I did think, those 2 long plays, especially, and Russell Wilson was actually not terrible in this game. It wasn't great. 20 of 29 for 270. And, again, a lot of that is volume, but you still wonder about that Ravens secondary. I know it's been significantly better since they made the switch with Hamilton and Humphrey midseason, but in terms of like playing the ball, it's still a team that I don't really trust all that much. Like there's some memories this season of like, how did you not knock that down? How was that not an interception? And you do wonder if that'll come back to haunt them against Buffalo or Kansas City, whoever it may be, the rest of the way. But again, it went about as expected. Pittsburgh, I think you got to be realistic about this roster. It certainly feels disappointing. There's, the questions about Mike Tomlin are bubbling up yet again. How many coaches would have coached this team to 10 wins? It's not a very good roster overall. I think the fall off defensively at the end of the year, maybe you could question that a little bit, but offensively, this is not a great group of skill players. You don't have a good quarterback in Russell Wilson. You got fairly average running back play, in my opinion. And outside of Pickens, you just have no playmakers. And I think, walking into this game on the road at Baltimore, if you're disappointed that the Steelers didn't win, I don't really know what your expectations were. I think they were overmatched.
Yeah, I think you'd be disappointed in a couple of things. The utter lack of running game in this one here. Two, just one play. It's little, like they had 4th and literal inches in the first half. After a play, they ran short of the sticks to Freiermuth. Nice tackle to stop them from getting the first down. It's a tough ask to go for it on your own, like 29, 30 yard line.
Yep.
But the amount that was asked to get was minimal. And this is the same head coach last week against the Bengals when they were asked about him going for on 4th and 1 against them before halftime. He goes, if you can't gain a yard on 4th and 1, you don't deserve to win the damn game. Well, it's a playoff game now, and you're a significant underdog. You can't afford to give up possessions like that. And there was no thought to going for it. None. And meanwhile, Baltimore did go for it from their own 39 later on. 4th and 1 made it, of course. Yes, they have Lamar. The Steelers have Russell Wilson, who is a really bad sneaker. But guess what? They have Justin Fields. Bring him in. This is why you have him on the roster. Yep. They didn't do that option once. Fields threw a pass, but did not run the ball once. I don't know. It's little things like that. I understand why Steelers fans are so unhappy about this and why they want something. It's been like 7 years since they've won a playoff. I think they've lost their last 7 playoff games. Not even 7 years. It's longer than that, but
I agree. And like, I'm speaking as a non-Steelers fan. So I don't feel their pain intimately as they do, but I just, I think you could say, they haven't won a playoff game in 7 or 8 years, whatever. Like, I mean, should they have even made the playoffs that many times in that span? Like, probably not. It's like, look at the quarterbacks for most of those games. I mean, you're going in with Mason Rudolph or Duck Hodges or Kenny Pickett or Russell Wilson. It's like, I get it. I get the frustration. I think the worst thing that happened for the Steelers is they showed signs of life offensively in the middle of the season, right? Like beating the Ravens. They had like that 4 or 5 game stretch where like Russell Wilson, like, is he like a dark horse MVP candidate all of a sudden? And I think that raised expectations to a point that were probably never realistic. And I think this team all along was probably a lot closer to the team that we saw over the last 5 games than, weeks like 6 through 11 or whatever it was when they went on that run. You mentioned the 4th and 1. That was, I get it. You're at your own 29 yard line, but like you said, in this situation, when you're overmatched, I think you have to create those breaks for yourself. I would have liked to see them go for it. And the worst possible thing happened after they punted. Not only did the Ravens, put a touchdown on the board to make it 14-0, but they put together an 8-minute drive to do that.
Yep.
It's like they sucked up like the entire second quarter on that drive. And, the Ravens were also, really able to kill clock late in this game. They had a 6+ minute drive to end up kneeling it out to prevent the Steelers from potentially looking at a backdoor cover.
And Tomlin didn't call any timeouts either, by the way, on that.
Yeah, right. Which is great. As somebody who was sitting on the 9.5, I was totally fine with that. Didn't want Pittsburgh to get anything fluky at the end there. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we knew kind of going into this weekend we were cruising toward Baltimore Buffalo. I'm glad we got that without any hiccups.
Yeah, definitely. Because I don't think again, this thing said every year. Unless you're a Steelers fan, nobody wanted the Steelers to advance, or unless you're a Chiefs fan, I guess. But nobody else wanted that to happen. We all want to see Baltimore Buffalo. We want to see this matchup happen. So let's talk Baltimore Buffalo. It's going to be the game of the 4 games this week that I'm most excited about. I can tell you that already. Yeah. I'll be excited about all 4 of them, but that's definitely going to be the one I'm most excited about. They're pretty evenly matched teams. I did my own guess the lines. I set Buffalo as a 2.5 point favorite. Basically, the home field advantage is what I'm giving them. I expect a good amount of offense here, although both defenses are sneakily better than people realize. I think Baltimore, since the Hamilton change, has been a pretty good defense, and they're always a good run defense.
So we've actually seen some pretty significant line movement already. I mean, this
Okay.
opened at Bills -1.5 last night. It is now Ravens -1.5 at both
Oh,
DraftKings and FanDuel, which is interesting. Obviously, Baltimore holds the dominant head-to-head win in the regular season over Buffalo. But I'm with you. I think these are two extremely evenly matched teams. I will hear out any argument for how you think this game plays out. I would lean Ravens. I think the home field factor, it definitely matters. We're looking at like 24 degrees in Buffalo on Sunday night. I think that's Bills weather more so than it is Lamar Jackson weather. But I think Baltimore, to me, is still the more reliable defense. I talked about in the Steelers game, they gave up a couple of big plays. Certainly that's a concern against Buffalo, but again, with a team that doesn't have that big time downfield receiver necessarily, I think the Ravens defense is pretty well equipped to go up against these weapons for Buffalo. And, I think we also see a version of Lamar in the postseason that's more willing to run the ball, right? That was something we didn't touch on when we talked Steelers Ravens. I mean, there was a point, like, I think it was in the first half where Lamar ran it on like 5 plays in a row. And,
very
like
first
the
drive.
podcast was baffled. Everybody's baffled. And you're just not used to seeing that. And, I think that's something that the Ravens didn't really want to do for preservation purposes in the regular season. But I think we could kind of see Lamar go up a level as a runner. And, the Bills have struggled against running QBs this season. They're bottom 5 in yards per carry allowed to the quarterback position. Ravens are top 5 in that metric, did a really good job slowing down Josh Allen on the ground in that first matchup. Baltimore ran for 270 yards as a team in the first meeting. They should get Zay Flowers back in the mix. I think that will be a key here. And then the other thing that I was looking into last night, Jeff, I think the turnover situation, whatever it ends up being, that will be what swings this game. Neither of these teams turn the ball over. Buffalo only has like 8 turnovers all season, which is crazy. Each team only has 1 multi-turnover game on the year. Baltimore's, of course, was that first matchup with the Steelers where they turned it over 3 times. But the Buffalo defense has been a lot more turnover dependent than Baltimore's. They've generated like almost twice as many turnovers as the Ravens have. So I'm interested to see how much that matters. If both teams kind of play like they have offensively and Buffalo's not generating turnovers, I think that's something that could favor Baltimore. It feels like a field goal game either way, but I would lean toward the Ravens initially.
Okay. I've got a small Bills lean at this point in time. I got to dive into it a little bit more. I want to see what happens with Zay Flowers this week. I think that will matter. Not having in this one there, but I just think in Buffalo matters. But then again, I mean, it's interesting because both these teams have so many playoff ghosts. Allen, it's not necessarily on him, right? Except for maybe his very first playoff game at Houston, where he threw some really weird
that was
plays.
a different version of Josh Allen.
Yes,
that feels like a decade ago.
Yes, exactly. But Lamar, I mean, last year against the Chiefs, really struggled to get it done. They both had run into the Chiefs wall, but in the case of Lamar, they've lost to other teams. They've lost to the Titans in the playoffs. They lost, obviously both teams lost to the Chiefs last year. They ran into that wall, but Allen did lose to the Bengals a couple of years ago. That happened. But still, it's definitely a thing where they need to get over that hump. And even the winner of this game isn't over that hump, is the funny thing. They still have to go probably against the Chiefs. We'll see.
In all likelihood, the Chiefs, who are 7.5, 8-point favorites, depending on where you look, over Houston right now. I think I would actually look at the under in this game too, in Ravens Bills 51.5. Scary to take the under with these two offenses. No question about that. But again, I think the weather could be a factor. And, something that I was looking through Lamar's playoff game log last night. He has never played in a playoff game with a total that's finished higher than 44, which is really interesting.
Really?
Was pretty shocked to find that. I played in a lot of defensive battles. It's been the total opposite for Josh Allen. He's played in like 6 playoff games that have gone essentially over 50. So, maybe depending on how you think this game plays out, maybe you just throw that out. But an interesting note nonetheless, that these Ravens playoff games with Lamar Jackson have been overwhelmingly lower scoring. I mean, nothing that's touched a 51.5 total.
Yeah, you're right. Let's talk a little Houston and Chargers, and then we'll talk about Houston's and the Texans and the Chiefs after that. But this was Justin Herbert's worst playoff game, worst game maybe period ever. He had help, as the song goes. He had some help for sure. Will Dissly in particular. Quentin Johnston didn't help out that much, but 2 drops by Disley, 1 probably leads, maybe they get a touchdown on that drive. It would have at least led them to a good chance of getting a first down. They settled for a field goal right after the fumble. And then the other, of course, led to an interception and a long return. But Herbert was bad on other throws too. He had some really bad throws. I thought a play that was kind of the highlight track of bad plays for Herbert was the interception immediately after the Chargers got the turnover. And he just threw it up for grabs. It was just a horrible throw.
Yeah, it was. I'm a Justin Herbert defender, as you know, and this was a tough one for me. 14 of 32 for 242, 1 touchdown, and 4 interceptions for Justin Herbert. And like you said, I mean, Will Disley cost the Chargers probably, I don't know, 9 points worth of EPA in this game. He was brutal. But it kind of felt like Herbert almost kind of had to go into desperation mode, much like we saw from Jordan Love late in the game when this was a 2-score game. But the pick 6 and then an interception right after that by Stingley that was brought back into the red zone. That's really what ended up sealing this for Houston. And it's interesting, like it goes down as a blowout win for the Texans. I lost the under 42.5 on this game, Jeff. That was one of my plays at Bookies Plus. The live total was 29.5 with 15 seconds left in the third quarter. And we had 18 points go up in about 4 minutes. And the difference ended up being the blocked extra point returned for 2 points. That made the total 44 instead of what would have been 42. So not bitter about that at all. But
no, never.
It's interesting that Houston, kind of like Buffalo, I guess, in some ways, but it played out differently, did not really control this game until late. It wasn't until the pick 6 that this was a 20-6 game. It was still 1 score at that point. And, even Houston's touchdown that put them up 7-6 in the first half. I mean, that was like 3rd and long. CJ Stroud drops the snap. He's rolling out. And there's Xavier Hutchinson just sitting wide open in the middle of the field for a huge gain. So certainly it's a confidence builder. If you're Houston, it felt like everybody was on the Chargers here. And, I think Houston is carrying some level of momentum into Arrowhead, but at the same time, I don't look at this and say, oh man, Houston's back, baby. Like I still think offensively, it's going to be a lot more of a slog against Kansas City next week. Defensively, though, I think they have some advantages against this Chiefs team, especially, that pass rush going up against the Chiefs offensive line that struggled this season. This is another game where I would lean under. You get 42 right now at BetMGM. It's down to 41.5 at some other spots. I actually think the Texans have a reasonable chance to cover this game. Like I could see it being a game where Kansas City wins comfortably, but they only win by 7, instead of the 8 or 9 that we might need to cover this. I don't know that the Chiefs are fully capable of routing a team right now. With that said, they needed the bye almost as badly as Detroit did. They've got Hollywood Brown back. They've got Xavier Worthy more involved over the last few weeks. So I think if there was ever a time for the Chiefs offense to take a big step forward, I actually think it could be in the postseason.
I think they took a half step forward already. I thought the Christmas game against the Steelers was that half step.
Sure.
Maybe even a little bit the week before against the Texans when they played. I felt like some things were kind of turning in the right direction for Mahomes. And it's so funny. That game, they were only 3-point favorites, 3.5-point favorites because Mahomes had the bad ankle.
Right.
Now we're 7.5 now. But going back to the Texans Chargers, couple of things. You mentioned the play to Hutchinson. That was crazy. And that was a huge turnaround because they were doing nothing in that game offensively prior to that. And all of a sudden, Stroud felt confident. He made a couple of throws that were pretty good. Later on in the game, Mixon was getting some good runs. They found Collins a couple more times. And yet there was still another critical play that we haven't mentioned either. The interception that wasn't by Derwin James. That was a big play. Because not only would they have had the pick and the return and then the penalty on top of that,
right?
Instead, they get the possession. They have this. They get to like 2nd and 40 and still get a field goal out of it. That was huge. I mean, there was the penalty, and then they got another holding penalty on that, and yet Houston still scored 3 points on that drive, as opposed to no momentum. Chargers getting the ball, maybe good down in distance. Chargers blew it on failed on 4th down on the first drive of the third quarter. After they did force a turnover, they were in plus territory, couldn't get the score. I mean, I think that was the right call to go for it. By the way, they just didn't convert. Again, another play run short of the 6. A hell of a tackle on that play.
That was a brutal play call. It's like
Yeah.
way short of the sticks in that situation. But yeah, it was a nice defensive play. And no, you're right. I mean, you're totally right to mention the Derwin James play. I mean, that was a 45-yard return. He picked it off midway. He was like in the middle of the end zone, ran it all the way back to the 40-yard line. And like, that was like a no question interception to me. I was shocked, when they came back from break and all of a sudden it's like, oh, Texas had the ball again. And like you said, we're able to, overcome the penalty and still work a field goal. I just, I just think looking ahead to divisional weekend, if you're Houston, you cannot depend on getting 4 turnovers out of the Kansas City Chiefs, right? And I think the Texans made enough mistakes. I mean, they fumbled on their first play from scrimmage in the first quarter. That only resulted in a field goal for the Chargers. I think if you make those kind of mistakes against Kansas City, you're just not going to be able to survive in the same way that you would against this Chargers team this week, which is crazy because I would say going in, the Chargers have been one of the better teams in limiting those kind of mistakes, right? You would never, like Justin Herbert would be very low on the list of quarterbacks who would throw, multiple interceptions in a postseason game. So it makes this a difficult game to evaluate as far as, what do you take from it? What do you throw out? But I think if you're the Kansas City Chiefs, you are totally fine with this rematch against Houston.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would have been more concerned about the Chargers also.
I agree.
Yeah, Houston looked broken. They punted from the Chargers 41 early on. Well, they would have, but they took the intentional delay a game to go to the 46 instead, and all that. And that's a team that just doesn't, instead of, they have Fairbairn who kicks all these long field goals. They didn't even think about trying him.
Nope.
I don't know. There's just so many different ways this could have gone. But anyways, all right, enough about that. Let's quickly talk a little bit about tonight's game in Arizona. Rams and the Vikings. What's your take on this game?
So I'm on the Vikings here. Okay. This isn't going to be a 5-star play of the week by any means, but I think you have to look at this game one of two ways. You're either panicked about Sam Darnold after what we saw in week 18 at Detroit, or you think Sam Darnold will play more like the player that we saw for 95% of the regular season. So I'm leaning more on the latter. It is Sam Darnold. He's never played in a playoff game. So I understand if there is some hesitancy there. But I think Minnesota's a better team. I think they're the better defense. I think they've been coached just as well, if not better, than a Sean McVay team, which I think is saying a lot. So I think if Sam Darnold plays just a slightly above average game, I think that could be enough for Minnesota.
Yeah.
I think you also have to factor in the location change. It's brutal for a number of reasons. Nobody wants that, but I don't think you can view that as anything but a plus for Minnesota. I mean, you're taking a home game away from the Rams, and maybe you think there'll be more Rams fans in the building in Arizona. There probably will, I guess, for proximity purposes, but it's a big deal, and I think it throws off the entire normalcy of a playoff week of preparation. If you're the Rams, like if you're Minnesota, nothing really changes. You're just going to a location that's slightly more south. That's about it. Yeah. So I'm on the Vikings here. I think they could win this game. There is just some kind of mystery with the Rams because of the way they finished the regular season. You put up all those points against Buffalo, and then you win 3 more games when you're not even getting to 20. I don't know which version of the Rams shows up. We had a good question in the chat here. Could we see a legacy game from ex-Triple Crowner Cooper Kupp against this shaky Minnesota defense? Minnesota has a great defense, but they do give up a ton of passing yards. Like that's the way to beat them. I think is throwing the ball. I think they'll do a pretty good job on Kyren Williams. And I think with Kupp, there are also 2 ways to look at it. You could say, maybe there is some sort of injury. Maybe he's not at 100%. Or you could say, all right, maybe they've been kind of keeping him under wraps. And we see him a lot more involved in this game than he's been for the last 5 or 6 weeks. I think they're going to need him, right? I don't think you can survive and win this game if you're the Rams with Cooper Kupp going like 2 for 29 and Puka Nacua getting 18 targets. I think you need more balance there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think both teams are going to struggle to run the ball. Maybe Aaron Jones is a little bit more effective than Kyren Williams, but I think this game is going to come down to which team can protect their passer better. Because I think Brian Flores dials up all these blitz schemes. We know about that. The Rams have Jared Verse. They have a pretty good pass rush. We've seen Darnold under pressure versus Darnold otherwise, and it's a stark difference. So if they can buy Darnold time, allow Jefferson, allow Addison to get open against these corners, then and they didn't have Hawkinson in the previous game either. You got to remember that. That this is a little bit different from the rematch. So I took the Rams on the site when we were picking earlier for staff picks. I have a Vikings vibe now. And I know I'm trying to have it both ways, but I do feel like this is the Vikings probably is the side now I would take if I were to bet this game. It's pretty much a stay away for me though.
Yeah, I mean, it could go either way, right? I mean, you wouldn't. I'm making it very clear. I would not be shocked if the Rams won, but I think if I'm putting my money on it, I'm going to take Minnesota. I think that's the safer side, if you will, especially with this game now being at a neutral site. And I think the Rams have made strides certainly. I think in the trenches on both sides, especially that defensive line feels a lot more dangerous now than it was earlier in the season. But I think the Minnesota weapons against the Rams secondary, that's probably the biggest mismatch in this game. And again, if Sam Darnold doesn't have to play perfect, I don't think the Rams are that level of opponent where you need Sam Darnold to be at his absolute best. He can't be airmailing 8 throws in the red zone like he did in week 18. We know that. But I think if you could just get a decent version of Sam Darnold, let Justin Jefferson, let Jordan Addison, even Jalen Naylor, he's played really well lately. Let those guys win their matchups against that Rams secondary. And I think that's the way for Minnesota.
Indeed. I want to talk about the coaching changes, but first, quick note from our friends at LIV Golf. A new season of LIV Golf Fantasy is coming in 2025. New prizes, new ways to win, and more are coming in the new season. Get ready to play and sign up now at fantasy.liv. That's LIV golf.com. Thanks to LIV for their sponsorship of the RotoWire podcast. Let's talk about Mike Vrabel. Let's talk about Mike McCarthy.
Yeah, well, I guess we could start with Vrabel, who, of course, is taken over in New England, and makes sense, right? I mean, for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the connections to that franchise. I think the type of coach that they were looking for. I think he makes total sense, and you got the quarterback in place, so maybe you don't feel like you need the offensive genius type. I think you're relying on Mike Vrabel to kind of elevate the rest of the roster, which still needs a lot of work, right? I mean, you got a really nice cornerback at Christian Gonzalez. You got Drake May. That might be it. I mean, how many other guys are like for sure he's on the roster 2 or 3 years from now? There's not many. So I think Mike Vrabel, knows what he's signing up for. I think this is not a team that should expect, to all of a sudden win 10 games next year. I think there are going to be steps here, and I think he'll be given a longer leash, certainly a much longer leash than Gerard Mayo was, in order to make that happen. So you kind of hate the way it went down for Mayo. There's been a lot of that reaction over the last week, kind of felt like he was never given a chance. I totally get all that, and I agree with it. I don't know what your expectations were giving him that roster this season, but at the same time, I don't think if you're the Patriots and internally you don't feel like he's the guy, you're under no obligation to keep him just to be nice, And I think there are a lot of factors at play here that I don't really want to dive into as far as that decision goes, but Mike Vrabel is one of the best coaching candidates on the market coming into this past season. It was kind of surprising he didn't get a job. Felt like it was going to happen here. And to me, this feels like a perfect fit.
Yeah. And they did. The only thing you could say is like, they didn't do a real coaching search. They did the whole like, we have interviewed Pep Hamilton. Okay. But this is like, they interviewed like 2 people and they didn't really do a full search outside of, the whole, their own tree. They knew what they wanted to do all along, but that's why they made the decision. I guess though, at the same time, if you knew you're going to do that, well, I mean, you got to act quickly. I get all of that. So I'm okay with that.
Yeah, me too. And, I mean, Mike Vrabel, of course, with the ties to New England, I think this always made the most sense for him as a landing spot. And, interested to see what he brings from that time in Tennessee. Right. And I think the most impressive thing that he did with that roster, it was a good roster in Tennessee. It wasn't a great roster. But I think he was one of those guys who certainly maximize the talent in front of him. I don't think a lot of people saw that Tennessee team as like, a top 2 team in the AFC for a good 2 or 3 year stretch. And, again, I don't think it's going to be 2025 where the Patriots take off, but if they can make smart roster moves, if they can hit another draft, I think we're looking at a team that will certainly be a factor 2026 and beyond. As you mentioned, we also have Mike McCarthy out in Dallas.
Yeah,
kind of a weird situation. There's been whispers about this. There's been meetings with McCarthy and Jerry Jones over the last few weeks. Obviously, most coaches are either fired immediately after week 18 in the case of Gerard Mayo, or the next day or two. It's a little bit rare for a team to take this long to make the decision.
It is. He was under contract until tomorrow, I think, or maybe today was the deadline. But at either rate, they did try to negotiate, it sounded like, but I don't know. I don't know what the, I haven't read any like of the background on this. They're like, if it was legit negotiation, or it was like, okay, 1-year contract or something like that.
Yeah.
It is funny. They denied the Bears the chance to interview him
Right.
while he's still under contract. They, okay, at least the Bears kind of forced them to that there. I like that.
Well, I get the impression that there was like a good faith effort on both sides to try. Like, I think McCarthy wanted to stay there. I think the Cowboys were open to having him back. And the reporting around this today has been that they just couldn't agree on the length of the contract, which I get. If you're Dallas, you probably don't want to commit for several years. And if you're McCarthy, you're looking to lock in as much as you can. The early reports are that Chicago remains interested, and then New Orleans is the other team that may throw its hat into the ring for McCarthy.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. How attractive is the Dallas job? How does it compare to like the Chicago job versus other jobs?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like prestige wise, it's obviously number one, right? Like you can make a case that like the Jacksonville job is appealing for roster flexibility reasons, and if you're a Trevor Lawrence believer and all that. But the Jaguars are like the complete opposite of the Cowboys. If you care about that as a candidate, do you want to coach one of the premier franchises? Do you want to kind of be almost an instant, face of the league type of guy? For some coaches that might matter. For others, it might not. I still, I think it's a fairly appealing situation. And part of it maybe depends on your view of Dak Prescott, who's, he's only 31. I think he's still got good years left in him. It's just, what is the ceiling for Dak Prescott? You have one of the 5 best receivers in the NFL in CeeDee Lamb. I think you still have a really good defense when healthy. You got a lot of premier players on that defense. So I think it's a pretty appealing job. It's going to be an eye of the beholder thing. Do you want the spotlight of the Dallas Cowboys? Do you want to work for Jerry Jones?
Yeah. And, they're going to have some cap issues too. I mean, that's the other problem is like, is Jerry Jones going to spend to make, are you going to say we're all in and then do nothing like he did last year? That's part of it there. So, well,
you're also in a tough division all of a sudden too, where, obviously Philly's not going anywhere. Washington feels like, they could be set up for success for a long time. Giants, they're not included in this discussion, but it's, in theory, I think it should be a semi-win now situation, but you're walking into like the Cowboys always have pressure on them, regardless of what the roster looks like, regardless of who the coach is. Like it's always kind of feels like at least playoffs or bust, maybe Super Bowl or bust in the delusional heads of Cowboys fans. So again, it depends on whether or not you're the personality type who wants to take that on. But it's the Dallas Cowboys job, right? I mean, it's like being the manager for the Yankees, or being the head coach of the Lakers. Like it's going to have appeal, I think, for most candidates.
Yeah, I've seen some buzz like Ben Johnson. It could be down to the Raiders versus the Bears. I'm like, is the Cowboys entering the fray? Does that change things up? Would he prefer, like, I wouldn't want to go to the Raiders, except for maybe that Tom Brady's involved. You get to kind of handpick your GM, but you don't have a quarterback. The Bears, you have a quarterback, but you don't get to choose your GM. You've got some other issues there, perhaps. And then Dallas, I mean, you have Dak and Lamb. I mean, that's a pretty good start. But what else are you going to have there? That's the tricky part there. So I don't know. I'm curious what people think about what is the most attractive job out there still remaining there. And we haven't mentioned your Jaguars. I apologize for that.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's an obvious candidate. I don't even think New England is like that appealing. It's more appealing to Mike Vrabel specifically than it would be your average head coaching candidate. I mean, I think if the Jaguars would have just got rid of Trent Baalke, that's probably the most appealing job from a football perspective in terms of, like I said, roster flexibility. In theory, you have your quarterback, very winnable division, new stadium coming. There are reasons why that job makes sense. But, we've seen all the reports. I mean, some people don't want to be tethered to essentially, in my opinion, a lame duck GM who continues to for whatever reason, hold his job. Chicago, Chicago's appealing. It's not the Cowboys, but it's still a premier franchise. I think, it's almost like the Red Sox job was, 15, 20 years ago in some ways, where it's like, man, if you could be the guy who leads the Bears to a Super Bowl, I mean, you are king in that city. And I think that could be appealing for some candidates too.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So anyway, it'd be fun to watch that one play out. By the time we finish, I'm assuming we'll have huge, massive breaking news about an hour from now, and
that's usually how it goes. But that's why you can hear us on Sirius XM talking about it tonight.
Very good, very good. Catch us tonight, 8 to 10 Eastern time, Monday through Thursday. In fact, on Sirius XM Fantasy, that's channel 175. All right, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thanks for tuning in. Special wildcard weekend reaction podcast. Nick and I will be back at it again next week for the divisional round reactions. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.